Thanks, Natalie, and thank everyone for having me. This is really exciting. As Natalie mentioned, I'm not actually an archaeologist, but I really appreciate you guys having me on anyway to talk about some of the stuff I've been working on. Let me go ahead and share my screen so that we have, wait, that's not what I wanted to do. Well, okay, can you guys see my screen? Are we good to go?
Yes, that's
Wonderful.
perfect.
Wonderful. So I've been researching the 1918 pandemic for about 5 years now. So this has been a really interesting year in total because of the nature of the pandemic itself that's happening right now. But also, it was always kind of hard to convince people why studying something that happened 100 years ago is directly applicable to what's going on now and why we should really care about temporal depth and things like that. One of the good things about being here in this Zoom room with you guys is that I don't really have to convince a room full of archaeologists that history is important. So I'm really happy about that. So here's an outline of what I'm going to be going over today. I'm going to be going through a brief intro and my motivations for talking about my topic here and just general overview of my, like if I zoom out of my research, what the really main purposes are. I'm going to be talking about a couple different theoretical things that are going to frame this research, some specific things about what I've been studying and finding in my population, which is the island of Newfoundland, of the province of Newfoundland and Labrador, some implications and conclusions, and then I'm going to wrap it up. So one of the things that one of the main patterns that has been ongoing in the last year is this, I noticed there was this kind of rediscovery of the fact that social inequalities are driving differential risk in morbidity and mortality in populations. These things just kept popping up, and every time I saw a new article about this, I would think, oh, like this is being rediscovered again. They're writing about this again as if it was a brand new discovery, as if no one had ever done anything with this before. And in reality, people have been studying social inequality in risk for infectious diseases and pandemics specifically for decades and decades and decades. And so I just kept thinking, why is there so much disconnect between what is happening in the ivory tower and putting out research on this stuff and what is happening, the news that's coming out essentially. And of course, some of that is disconnect between, lag in academic publications to becoming, layperson knowledge, but it was just an interesting thing. So I think this is a good moment to really talk about social inequalities and how anthropologists specifically have been studying inequality in the past and applying them to past situations and how we can apply them to present situations. So one of the main theories that really drives my research and drives a lot of research in infectious disease mortality and biodemography is that of the epidemiological transitions. There are three big ones. So the first one occurred alongside the agricultural revolution about 10,000 years ago, which transitioned human populations into what a famous demographer calls the age of pestilence and famine. Before agricultural revolution, crowd diseases didn't really exist. They really started to pop up as human populations started to grow and as health generally started to decline because of sedentism and malnutrition and things like that. So during this period of time, people died from very high rates of infectious diseases, low rates of chronic diseases. The second epidemiologic transition occurred alongside the Industrial Revolution about 250 to 100 years ago. Of course, that's a really wide range and Populations went through the Industrial Revolution at very different times. But this transitioned to the age of receding pandemics and the age of degenerative and man-made diseases. So receding pandemics is as water sanitation procedure and things like that started to really take hold in urban populations, people started dying less and less from infectious diseases and died proportionately more from more chronic diseases. And people started living to older ages and started to die at proportionally high rates from degenerative diseases like cardiovascular disease, cancers, and multi-system organ failure, things that happen when you just grow to be very old and your body just stops working, essentially. And the final one is the third transition, which is newly, quote, newly described. It was described in the 90s, and it is currently ongoing, and it's characterized by new and re-emerging infectious diseases. So things like HIV causing the AIDS disease, multi-drug resistant and extensively drug resistant tuberculosis, SARS, MERS, Zika, COVID-19, all of these fall under new and re-emerging infectious diseases. The reason I wanted to bring this up and use this to frame this research is that there's one uniting factor in that these are all permanent and irreversible changes in population structure that are determined primarily by fundamental shifts in human behaviors. So this is how we try to convince anthropologists that this type of work is anthropological, because it is determined by human behavior. And a lot of the diseases that we're facing today are anthropogenic. So they're caused by human behaviors in one way or another, alongside, climate change and other things like that. But the other theoretical approach that I wanted to talk about is the biocultural approach to anthropology. And the epidemiologic transitions and biocultural anthropology are not mutually exclusive. And in fact, the person who described both of them at length and put them in context of anthropology is the same person. So they're utilizing both of these approaches in the study of infectious diseases with broad temporal depth. But this isn't a new approach, but it's gained a lot of momentum, like literally just in the last 10 years. So this is really up and coming in new research in anthropology. And it's the idea that culture and biology are inextricably united in a continuous feedback relationship of ongoing exchange. But this is problematic for some anthropologists, not because it doesn't have merit, but because cultural anthros and biological anthros have conflicting views sometimes about the mutual usefulness of each of those approaches. So for example, some cultural anthropologists maintain that biology and ecology are actually more appropriate for describing biomedical approaches and phenomena. So cultural anthropologists don't think that it's a good way to throw a very broad blanket over human societies, and it's not a really useful way of studying non-Western societies. In my opinion, that's just a misunderstanding of the point of the approaches, because of course you can apply this type of thought to, quote, non-Western societies. Because the biocultural synthesis, which was described in the late 90s and the early 2000s, sought to include political economic questions. So really, really zooming out and thinking about ultimate questions that determine health and disease. So not proximate questions that say an individual becomes infected with tuberculosis because there is tuberculosis in the area. It has to deal with things like, what are the systemic inequalities that are sustained over a long period of time that leads some to become more at risk than others. And this creates a situation that biocultural anthros have dubbed local biologies, where that human populations are going through this forever co-evolving feedback loop and developing adaptations biologically and culturally to their specific environments. And this is really the main crux of what I want to get at today, in that these theoretical approaches allow us to very broadly conceptualize health beyond a single moment. So a century ago, the 1918 influenza pandemic was a moment, and right now COVID-19 is another moment. So we have to be able to zoom out and critically think about how and why pandemic and epidemic moments happen, but also how they're all connected in their determinants and their consequences. So just a brief example here of how the biocultural approach works and can explain certain phenomena is through how race becomes biology, in a famous paper of the same name by someone named Lance Gravely. He describes the phenomenon of racial inequalities in infant mortality and life expectancy, despite the fact that we know that there's no biological basis for different races in humans. However, socially constructed race still manifests biologically, but it's a product of systemic racism, right? This is why we say, you know, race is not a risk factor, but racism is the risk factor that you're trying to pinpoint and really describe. So he kind of goes through these, it's 5 models for explaining racial inequalities. So people like to use socioeconomic status, they like to use health behaviors, psychosocial stress, social structure and cultural context, and then genetics is the 5th one. But it's really important to realize that genetics does not mean the same thing as intergenerational health. And intergenerational health is what is really trying to be described when we talk about how these vital statistics manifest as racial inequalities. So for example, I have a nice figure later on where when I talk about my Newfoundland work, but it's this cycle of how poor maternal health and malnutrition and low nutritional value and high blood pressure when a baby is in vitro can lead to a baby with low birth weight, a child that is stunted at the end of their childhood, and then those things just kind of go in this circular type direction, essentially, in that the health of one generation is compromised can lead to a compromisation of health in the next generation and around. So it's not really genetics, it's the compounding of intergenerational health that leads to these types of inequalities. And that's really biocultural anthropology. A couple things that are biocultural anthropology adjacent that I want to point out, and the reason I want to spend a couple minutes on these is because people have kind of been dancing around the theory of biocultural anthropology for a long time in other fields. So this is one of the most famous 1918 flu papers written, since people have been writing about the 1918 flu. It's called "Is the 19 Influenza Pandemic Over?" And it was written by Almond in 2006. And he found that babies who were in utero in 1918 displayed a bunch of things later in life in the 1980 through 1990 censuses. So they displayed lower educational attainment, increased disability rates, lower income, and overall lower socioeconomic status. And these things he attributed to being in utero during the 1918 flu. And of course, there's a lot of debate about how he got to that conclusion and if it's, even worth it to discuss, but this still is one of the most famous flu studies of all time because he really tries to link that moment to health much, much later in life. And so what this is showing here is the dotted line is influenza deaths per 100,000. Here's 1918. And then right after that, this is the 1919 cohort, the average health measured by a health index using something called the Survey of Income and Program Participation, decreases pretty significantly through the mid-1920s. So this is how he explained the poor health in early and later life for this cohort who was born in 1918. And I should say, Almond was an economist. So when I say that, other people are dancing around biocultural anthropology, I really do mean it, because they don't have a lot of anthropological knowledge. This guy was an economist, and he published this in a major economics journal. So, I could, talk forever about the ways in which fields of science don't really talk to each other and kind of talk past each other in terms of ideas and findings, but it's a good example. Oh, I'm sorry, I just scrolled. Another biocultural adjacent type study was published by these two demographers, Irma Elo and Samuel Preston, in 1992. And they really studied the effects of early life and conditions on adult mortality. So this is just a review paper, but they really went deep on this. And their main point is that health in childhood can determine health throughout the life course. So diseases such as pulmonary tuberculosis, hepatitis B, rheumatic heart disease, and fever, other respiratory infections can cause lasting biological and physiological trauma. And young people who suffer from diseases like these when they are young get sick more, and they get more ill than they would if they hadn't suffered these trauma diseases. Just like a personal anecdote example, I guess, my grandfather was born in 1917, and he grew up and lived in Baltimore. And he had rheumatic fever as a baby. And then when he was 53, he ultimately died of a heart attack, because that is a major consequence of having rheumatic fever later in life. It really compromises your cardiovascular system. Just think of all the ways it can be compromised with other health conditions as well. And I'll get into comorbidities in a little bit. And then people are constantly at risk of co-circulating viruses like common cold and influenza, and also non-pathogenic non-disease comorbidities like malnutrition. And so again, this is a demography study, so not anthropological, but still applying the same kinds of ideas. So now I'm going to start talking about my research in Newfoundland with that groundwork laid. I do field work in St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador. And on the left here, this is actually a picture of the city if you're coming in from the ocean. And on the left, far left, this big triangular house-looking building is called the Rooms Provincial Archives. It's a gold mine of archival data, and it's where I do all my archival research and data collection. And this picture on the right is one that I actually took, and it is the view out across the bay from the top floor of the archives up here. So it's a spectacular place, and Newfoundland is just basically a big rock and nothing else. And actually, fun fact that has nothing to do with anything I'm going to talk about, Newfoundland is the home of the oldest rocks in the world. They have rocks that are literally billions of years old. So really beautiful, amazing place. Definitely go there if you're looking for something different. So a little more information about Newfoundland in the early 20th century that is going to be important to remember. Early 20th century Newfoundland was a pre-industrial and pre-urban population, so there weren't really any major cities that we would consider to be major cities. Low population density across the board, and they were pre-second epidemiologic transition, which means that they were suffering from very high rates of infectious diseases compared to chronic diseases, which were very proportionately low. So most people were dying from tuberculosis, GI infections, and there was a very, very high infant mortality rate. And life expectancy was about 42 years in this population during this time. The economy and subsistence depended almost exclusively on fisheries. One of the sayings that they used then and still use now is cod is king, because that was what they subsisted on and what they sold. But the island was connected with the North Atlantic shipping routes. So they were connected with countries like Iceland and Norway and Denmark and all of those places. So everything had to be basically imported, and still is. I mean, I've been to Newfoundland multiple times to do my field work, and you can't really buy like guacamole because they can't afford to import the avocados. Fresh fruit is extremely expensive to get because they can't grow anything. It's amazing. It's like if you hold a banana up in Newfoundland, it's you just like take a second and think, how far did this banana have to travel to get all the way up here? So things are very expensive there. They always were, and they are currently. I conceptualize the island in terms of 4 highly variable geographic regions. So we got our yellow region here that does have the city of St. John's right there. This yellow region contained about 40% of the population in the early 20th century. Then the green, the north, the blue is the west, and the purple is the south. And actually in the south, it was completely geographically isolated. And to this day, it still is. You cannot get to Buren and Fortune Bay unless you take a boat from the yellow region here in the Avalon Peninsula. You cannot get to these places because there are no roads and there are no railroads or anything. Generally across the island, very, very poor health, especially in the outports, which are the very small village-like towns that exist around the perimeter of the island. So like I said, St. John's, there was a city here. There's a port here on the other tail of the H. We call this the H-shaped peninsula. And then up here in St. Anthony was like a moderately large town, and the rest were like small towns of a few hundred people at the most. There was no centralized healthcare to speak of. Very few doctors, mostly like minimally trained nurses. And they were overwhelmed by infectious diseases, especially tuberculosis, which is very important. And I am going to talk about that again, because it's an important comorbidity with influenza. Some 1918 flu specific stuff. Almost 2,000 people died during the 1918 pandemic out of a population of about 250,000. So the mortality rate was about 74,000 deaths per 10,000 people, or 74 deaths per 10,000, which is actually one of the highest mortality rates in the world. There are some that I can think of off the dome that are quite a bit higher, but Newfoundland was quite a bit up there, especially for a population that was nominally Western. The island or the regional breakdown of these mortality rates show, the South really, really suffered. They were over 100 deaths per thousand, while everyone else was hanging out around 62, 4, and 7 deaths per 10,000. So some of the earlier research that I've done was trying to explain why the South suffered so much compared to the other regions. And not only that, but the past research I've done is about sex-based mortality in the 1918 flu. And it turns out that female mortality was significantly higher in almost all of these regions, which is not typical for the 1918 flu. It's often been found that males have higher mortality across the board, but I have some theories as to why that is that I don't have time to share right now, but if I have time at the end, if someone has a question about that, I can kind of talk about that. But these negative numbers here for each region, those are male minus female mortality rates for each region. So all these negatives are higher female mortality, and it's higher in the South, the most. A couple reasons why I think the South might have been suffering the most are things like malnutrition, geographic isolation, social interdependence of people and gender roles, and very, very high rates of tuberculosis in that region, everywhere, but specifically that region. So I want to talk about more than just flu, because if we're going to be talking about what's important to really think about in terms of COVID and all health conditions and what we can expect in the next few decades, what are the consequences of this moment of COVID epidemiology? What are going to be the effects of the epidemiologies of other diseases and things like that? We have to think much broader than just COVID. And in the same way, my research has started to focus more on other pathogenic and non-pathogenic and social conditions other than just flu, because pandemics and these specific diseases do not occur in isolation. So what other infectious diseases and social conditions that exacerbate or put individuals at high risk of the pandemic infection? That's really where we're going to start to find the answers to socioeconomic inequalities. In Newfoundland, tuberculosis was no doubt that disease. And this was paired with anti-tuberculosis stigma, which is something that I've really only just started to dive into, but stigma is a very, very powerful socially constructed behavior that is like this self-perpetuating force. And also paired with things like mal and undernutrition that plagued most of the island, and socioeconomic inequalities. So when I talk about socioeconomic inequalities, a lot of this is really going to be coming from what I know about how much income outports can expect to make from their very limited exports. Like I've said before, this is really dependent on their ability to fish for cod and to sell their cod. But there's this other dimension whereby there was this merchant control in the capital of the island. So the amount of money that they could potentially make from their exports is not actually the money that they make, because there's this political economic factor that is systemically disadvantaging these very rural, isolated outport communities from the resources that they need to live and to actually import healthier food and things like that. Almost 1,000 people died every year from TB, which is a lot. So it's like almost the same death rate from the height of the 1918 influenza pandemic, but every single year. And you might be thinking, but you said 2,000 people died during the pandemic. So the pandemic had 3 different waves, and in the center, the big center wave, that's where about half the mortality happened. There was an early summer wave, and there was a little echo wave about a year later. So really like half the mortality was happening in the fall of 1918. So, just think like if that mortality happened every single year, that is what's happening with tuberculosis until quite late, as you will see. So this raises some questions about what the relationship is between these two diseases. So it's been suggested and studied elsewhere that the high frequency of tuberculosis deaths during the 1918 pandemic was really the turning point for its presence and mortality in the United States, whereby the 1918 pandemic was the thing that made tuberculosis mortality decline to its modern day levels. And the way it did that was that, frail individuals and or those already infected with acute or latent tuberculosis were at higher risk for co-infection and death, which then afterwards leaves a less frail population. And then, not only less frail, but there are less people after the pandemic that even were infected with tuberculosis. So it's breaking up a lot of transmission, but there are a lot of social factors that go into tuberculosis infection as well. In infectious disease studies and anthropology of infectious diseases, we call them like ultimate determinants of infection and mortality. And those are things that don't really change from disease to disease. So this is what the mortality of tuberculosis looked like in the United States. And these, the Neumer 2009, 2011 are the main papers that really go into detail about this. But this dotted red line here is the 1918 flu. There's a little spike, and then there was this major drop off of flu mortality. And yeah, you can say the axis on the y-axis is, expanded a little or whatever, but this is a really significant drop. And you can really see using, US Census data and Department of Health, Education, and Welfare that there was a significant drop here to almost zero for females, a little bit higher for males, which keep that in mind. I wanted to find out if a similar significant drop happened right after the 1918 flu in Newfoundland, and if there was any cultural information that I could use to explain why or why not we see that same drop that could be associated with the 1918 flu. So I use this model called join point regression analysis. And the reason this is the perfect model is because it was made specifically to identify points of significant rate change. And the main benefits over regular piecewise regression, because you could totally go in there with your data and say like, oh, it's changing here, and then, add in one piece at a time. But this model is really, really powerful because it estimates points of significant change without predetermined input from me. So it's a really powerful program. And, you don't have to worry, obviously, too much about the general model of it. But it's basically saying, these are the join points, and we're measuring something called the annual percent change between each estimated point. And that's the estimated rate change between each point of the mortality rate. Or, this originated as a way to study cancer incidence rates, and it's developed by the National Institutes of Health, but you can apply it really to any study that uses rates. So here is the results, a figure of the results that I have found in Newfoundland. So interestingly, in Newfoundland, the purple here is female mortality rates, and they are so much higher than those of male mortality rates, which are in the blue, and the red is total. So I am working a little bit, now it's in very early stages, trying to explain the details of why female rates were so much higher for the entire 4 decades of my study period. And they really don't even get close near the end of the beginning of the 1940s. But really, the important thing here is that I was looking for a significant decrease in TB mortality rates after the 1918 flu, or right around 1919 or 1920. And there's absolutely nothing. Yeah, they're steadily decreasing from about 1907 or 1908 through the end of 1939, but I didn't find any significant decrease in tuberculosis mortality rates in the critical time period that I'm looking at. A couple things that I wanted to remind you guys of is that my y-axis here is a little bit different. So the other figure was in terms of deaths per 100,000. This is deaths per 10,000. So what we're looking at here is tuberculosis mortality rates that are double that of the United States for almost the entire time period. And remember that these TB rates fell to almost zero in the United States. And whereas these, females are up here around 28, 29, and total is sitting still right here around 20 deaths per 10,000. So things were really, really bleak in terms of TB in early 20th century Newfoundland. And I should say that they don't consider tuberculosis to have really been under control until about 1970 there. I split the data up into regions to see if anything would pop out, and still there were no significant declines in tuberculosis in any region. And something notable is that actually in the West, there was really no change for about 2 straight decades there. And I think this is because they're actually in that little town that I mentioned up in the far northwest corner of the island, town called St. Anthony, there was just a little tuberculosis hospital called the Grenfell Mission. And they specialized in not treating TB because there wasn't really any treatment, but like making TB patients comfortable and giving them, food to eat and comfortable, clean places to stay. And they did extremely well there. So they stayed low, or they started much lower, they remained low. And then I think that this drop off here is really just an effect of overfitting these higher join point models. But still, there's really no significant declines in any of these regions that could be confidently associated with the 1918 flu pandemic. So a little bit of cultural context for this, because I think, epidemiology is great because it describes what is happening with the mortality and in other contexts, with morbidity and things like that. I think it's great, but what makes this anthropological is adding all of this cultural context and really trying to zoom out and explain why these things that I thought were going to happen with the mortality rates and had every reason to believe they would haven't happened. So there's something going on the human level. Newfoundland had really been struggling with high TB morbidity and mortality since before the 19th century even started. In fact, the first data that we get, the first quantitative data that we get is around the middle of the 1890s, and TB rates are extremely high, which means that they were really high beforehand too. But there's also this other interesting cultural element of very high rates of importation of contaminated meat products from the UK. And those meat products were spreading bovine tuberculosis to an unknown extent. I mean, there's a little bit of research or reports in 1911 that really talk about bovine TB, and as that's the primary cause of things like abdominal tuberculosis and other forms of extrapulmonary tuberculosis. But that's another factor, just importing those contaminated meats, but also not having a very good vetting process for those imports was really critical in spreading the pathogen that caused extrapulmonary tuberculosis in a lot of people on the island. I think this also speaks to the fact that people were pretty desperate for food that had good nutritional content, because diets that didn't include meat were primarily made up of flour and flour-based foods and cod. So there was virtually no fruits and vegetables that were found in these diets. So therefore, adults and children presented with all of these types of health conditions. So children with severe chronic mouth lesions, children with tooth loss and dental caries and scurvy and very low vitamin C, very low body weight, atrophied and wrinkled skin, very little muscular development, mental and physical lethargy, were things that were found mostly in the outports, where they couldn't afford to get high quality nutritional products, but also they couldn't physically get them there because of geographic isolation. And things were so bad in the mid-1910s that over 1/2 of all the men who were drafted for the regiment for the First World War were sent home because they were not physically capable of really doing anything. So this was a major, major problem. And this is where I want to come back to that circular model that I talked about when I talked about biocultural theory at the beginning, because this is where, you know, if adults are having these health conditions like stress, hypertension, diabetes, these are more modern conditions that the people of Newfoundland were not dealing with, but they were dealing with, you know, very, very little muscular development, mental health and physical lethargy, very low body weights, general, just very poor health, and things that are associated with these, specifically in women that have not been described in the record, include things like amenorrhea. So they're not having their cycles because of these really detrimental health conditions. Fertility was low, infant mortality was very high. So those things are intergenerational health problems that continue to compound all on one another, and lead to things like preterm births, low births, very high rates of stillborns in Newfoundland, high infant mortality, stunting, growth stunting, low height at the end of childhood, and things like that. This is where the cycle comes in, and this is where populations can fall into what people like to contextualize as genetic susceptibility to health issues and other diseases, but are really just intergenerational health problems. So wrapping it up here, and I'm going to try to put all of this together because I gave you a lot. So Newfoundland specific conclusions include, you know, the severity of the 1918 flu pandemic should not be considered in isolation, but in context with other infectious and social threats. The poor health of Newfoundland's population until the mid to late 20th century made them vulnerable to current and future emergent health threats because of that cyclical nature of poor intergenerational health that were really determined by, you know, those social and cultural conditions associated with meat imports and geographic isolation, no centralized healthcare, and those types of things. I also want to point out that it's becoming much more common to approach the study of infectious diseases and outcomes on health more holistically. That's kind of the major buzzword in anthropology, but you know, anthropology, public health, biomedicine, and things like that should embrace and at the very least understand these broad approaches. And that's one way that public health and biomedicine can really up their game, I guess, in terms of understanding health. Public health especially has this amazing framework called the social determinants of health, but they don't take into account temporal depth and history. And so that was kind of my contribution in a little publication I put in the American Journal of Public Health, and saying that anthropology can bring good context for population health and pandemics and mortality in general, so that we can better understand this moment. I think I have a couple more things here, but we should place a high value on how human behavior and culture becomes embodied as health, meaning that health inequalities do not exist in silos. They have very deep histories and origins. They build upon each other and they perpetuate. So by understanding the poor health, for example, of Newfoundland, and by extension, other populations that historically have had these other types of problems, we can understand their more broad risks to pandemic events today. And finally, heading back to the epidemiologic transition models, those really help us understand that determinants of human mortality and diseases are often anthropogenic, and those demographic shifts are anthropogenic. So they are a result of fundamental changes in human behavior, like for example, in the first transition, it was becoming sedentary, developing agriculture, increasing populations and things like that. Second transition, it was really all about sanitation. And then a little bit later down the line is biomedical advancement. But now specifically in the age of new and re-emerging infectious diseases, which is The third transition that we're in, we must use our knowledge of similar historical events to understand past drivers of mortality and health evolution, because those determinants are ultimate determinants and those don't really change with temporal depth. Whereas, the immediate determinant like influenza and COVID and HIV, those things change, but the ultimate determinants of risk often do not change. Here are all my references for the talk that I have given you guys, and here are all my thank yous. So thank you to the rooms for allowing me to do research there. Thank you to my advisor for being very patient with me, my funders, Robin Johnston for inviting me, and all of you for having me. Thank you guys so much.
Wow, thank you, Taylor. That was fascinating. And I really did enjoy hearing about that. And just, I think bringing into perspective the importance of looking at a variety of perspectives, I guess, and none of these things occur in a vacuum. And I think that's something that we talk about in archaeology and anthropology in general, is making sure that we understand that you can't separate out the biology from the culture. And all of these things are all connected, and between the environment, the natural environment, and how that affects human behavior and all those kinds of things. So I think I applaud you for that and bringing that all full circle. And let's see if anybody has any questions. You can put it in the chat, or you can raise your hand, or I know Christine likes to raise her hand with the little raise your hand thing. But otherwise, and I see Geraldine down there. I see you, Geraldine. So why don't you go ahead, Geraldine?
I have two questions, but I'll ask one first because I don't want to hog up the questions. I was wondering if you've actually looked at populations in Iceland and Greenland just to compare, because there are other similar isolated environments as well.
Yeah, great question. So there's a lot of research that's been done on Iceland. They've been, Cliff and Haggett are the primary people who've been working in Iceland, and they do a lot of work with flu epidemiology, basically throughout the 20th century. So they study all the flu epidemics and like seasonal, just regular old seasonal flu in Iceland. I mean, just in general, like off the top of my head, Iceland did pretty well during the 1918 flu pandemic. I mean, well, relatively, I mean, you can't do well during a deadly pandemic, but one interesting feature of Iceland's was that their waves were like very, very late compared to the typical waves because they were, well, they are an island population. I mean, Newfoundland is an island population, but Iceland was like a little bit ahead of the game and actually was very active in putting together, non-pharmaceutical interventions. They did a lot of closing of their borders. So they were able to get out ahead of it a little bit and then ultimately got it anyway. So their waves were quite a bit later. Greenland doesn't really have a lot of research done on it yet, but actually I'm on a team that is doing a project in 2022 through 2023 about the impacts of the 19 flu on indigenous populations, basically worldwide. And we're going to be looking really closely at Greenland and other, indigenous populations. So we're hoping to have answers there, but there's not really a lot of information about Greenland. I mean, in general, indigenous populations suffered at very, very high rates, some of the highest in the world. I know some Inuit populations in Labrador and Alaska suffered something like 80–90% mortality. So things were pretty bleak. There were a lot of interesting social things going on with that, and possibly even, biological things because of this intergenerational situation that I talked about, but hoping to have answers to that in the next couple of years. I don't have an answer for Greenland yet.
Cool, something more to study.
Yeah.
I'll ask my second question later because I don't want to take up.
Okay, there's always something more to study with this, which is pretty great. Okay,
let's
that one in the chat. What was the
Yeah,
situation
James, go ahead. Jim.
migration to and from Newfoundland at that time? There wasn't really a lot of migration. So the island is pretty notoriously very expensive to get to and very expensive to get off. There was a little bit of seasonal migration for wealthier like merchant families that were going back and forth between the city in Newfoundland and some smaller settlements in Labrador, like during the summer, just like summer trips. But in terms of migration, there wasn't really a lot. And on the island itself, I see this in my death records. I mean, that's my primary source of data. People mostly were born, lived, and died all in the same place. So there really wasn't a lot of movement happening at all. And in terms of World War I, Newfoundland was a belligerent nation because they were part of the British Empire. They were a dominion. So they were actually pretty gung-ho about the war, but compulsory enlistment didn't happen until just a few months before the war ended. So there wasn't even a lot of like traveling to Europe during the war. So migration, you know, as a demographer, I like dread this question because migration is the hardest thing to in demographic analysis. But mostly the migrations of Newfoundlanders was mostly happening between the island and Labrador during the summer. And there's a dip in like yearly respiratory mortality in the summers. And that is just what I attribute it to.
Good question, Jim. Does anyone else have any other questions for Taylor? Geraldine can ask her a second question if you want.
Thank you. My other question is just when you look at other environmental factors like food source and things, did you look at like the Industrial Revolution, just like the coal source and coal burning? Because I know that has a huge effect on tuberculosis.
Yeah, so that's a great example, and that's definitely a factor in populations that had gone through the Industrial Revolution, and we always keep that in mind. So places like cities in the United States, like Pittsburgh and Philadelphia and Boston and New York, tuberculosis was a major issue during the mid to late 19th century because that is one of the reasons, but Newfoundland was a pre-industrial population, so there wasn't any of that really going on. And so really like why was tuberculosis morbidity so high in Newfoundland is like one of the questions, like capital T, capital Q. I mean, you know, why was it so high for so long and why did it take so long to decline? But, you know, I'm specifically homing in on Newfoundland for my dissertation. So I in that way, unfortunately, I'm quite pigeonholed at the moment, but I'm hoping the next phase of the research that I just presented about the decline in tuberculosis, I'm going to start expanding it to research on other populations that are similar to Newfoundland and very dissimilar to Newfoundland during the same time period, because it really, this is really a pattern that falls into two camps. There are populations that had the same very drastic decline after the flu that the US shows, and there are others that do not exhibit that decline. And it seems to align with the fact that some populations had already gone through the Industrial Revolution and the others had not. And the ones that did go through the revolution have the decline, and the ones that did not do not have the decline. So I haven't quite gotten to the details of that yet, because like I said, I'm really zoomed in right now trying to finish my dissertation, but I am going to zoom out and really think about stuff like that. Yeah.
Thank you, Taylor.
You're welcome.
Does anyone else have any questions for Taylor? No one? Are you saying we need to let Taylor go to bed? Oh no, Jim has another question.
Was there a lower genetic diversity that might have been a factor? This is an interesting question, and the closest I can get an answer for you is, I guess specifically for the Newfoundland population, is that they were genetically diverse in that different parts of the island were settled by different European populations. So actually the first people to get to Newfoundland were the Vikings in the 11th century. That's where they landed. But they did not stay there. They got up and left. And then it was eventually settled by French, English, Irish, Portuguese. That's who settled on the island. So I'm going to be very upfront and say I don't know what the genetic diversity is like among all those populations. But there's no reason, in my opinion, to believe that that was a factor. That's not a great answer. I really apologize, but I'm not a geneticist. I love genetics, but I am just not very good at it. So I had to deal with that and move on. Yeah, appreciate those avocados for sure. Especially if you're located in San Diego right now. Y'all are in like one of the prime spots for avocados.
We could tell you all about the history of avocados in San Diego County because it's such a huge commodity here.
Yeah. I love avocados. I mean, we do fine with them up here in Missouri, but like, oh man, the first time I was actually up in Newfoundland, I feel like I went to every restaurant in town and like just looking for guacamole, and it's just not, it's too expensive. They literally said that. They're like, we can't afford to import them and make you guac, sorry. It's fine.
Well, and thanks to Colleen. I think Colleen was calling from the Channel Islands up there on the Central Coast, sounds like. Looks
Cool.
like. I'm assuming CSUCI is Channel Islands. So thanks for joining us, Colleen.
Yeah. Yeah, well, you're welcome to everybody in the chat, and thank you all again for having me. This was really fun. I hope you guys have, good lecture series coming up, and I really appreciate the opportunity to come and talk to you guys about this, even though it is very definitely not archaeology. I think that there are some good applications and some information to keep in mind as we move forward.
Thank you very much too. And it's a good reminder, just like I said, about making sure we look at a variety of perspectives whenever we're doing our work.
Yeah, to me, that is a really, really excellent and unique thing about anthropology, is that anthropologists in general are very interested in the much bigger kind of ultimate questions. I mean, other fields are very, very specific, and I think that is great, and there's a great place for that, but anthropology does the other important work by really taking into account the broad context of human nature and human phenomena. So that's what I really love about this field, and I'm really happy I got to talk to you guys about it.
Thank you. We are a giant umbrella, anthropology.
We are.
The biggest umbrella of them all.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, if no one has any more questions, then we'll go ahead and wrap it up. And
Great, I'll go ahead and stop sharing so that y'all can escape.
Thank you, Taylor.
You're welcome. Thank you all. Good night.
All right. Thank you.